The unmarked sedan came to a stop, just as the first light of dawn broke over the sleepy subdivision in Clarksville, Tennessee, its headlights cutting through the morning fog that hung low over manicured lawns and sleeping homes. Detective Sarah Chen sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, her hands gripping tight, staring at the brick colonial with its neat flower beds and the basketball hoop mounted above the garage door. 6 years. 6 years this person had lived here, waved to neighbors, mowed grass, existed in plain sight while Rosemary Hartley lay in the ground and her family waited for answers that seemed like they would never come. Chen took a slow breath, felt the weight of the arrest warrant in her jacket pocket, and nodded to her partner. This was the day that would shatter everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them. This was the day a ghost from 2018 would finally have a name and a face, and nothing would ever be the same. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Cases like this take months of research and investigation to bring you, and your support helps us tell the stories that need to be heard. The arrest in March of 2024 closed a wound that had been bleeding for 6 years. A case that had haunted Clarksville since the autumn of 2018, when a 16-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her was stolen from a world that should have kept her safe. The DNA match that led Detective Chen to this quiet suburban street that morning was a result of cutting-edge genetic genealogy. The same technology that had caught the Golden State Killer and was now solving cold cases across America. But before we get to how they caught him, before we talk about family trees and forensic breakthroughs, and the moment everything clicked into place, we need to talk about who was taken. We need to talk about Rosemary. Rosemary Ann Hartley was 16 years old in the fall of 2018, a junior at Montgomery Central High School, and if you'd asked anyone who knew her to describe her in one word, they would have said bright. Not just academically bright, though she was that too. Honor roll every semester since middle school, the kind of student teachers loved because she actually did the reading and asked thoughtful questions. But bright in the way that some people just are, like they carry their own light with them into every room. She had one of those smiles that made you smile back even if you were having a terrible day. She laughed easily and often, a real laugh that came from somewhere genuine, not the performative kind that teenagers sometimes use like armor. She was tall for her age, almost 5'9", with auburn hair she wore long and straight, usually pulled back in a ponytail when she was focused on something. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that served her well in debate club where she'd learned to argue points with a precision that made her coach predict she'd make a hell of a lawyer someday. She played clarinet in the marching band, not because she was particularly gifted at it, but because she loved the community of it, the way 100 kids could make something beautiful together if they all showed up and did their part. She volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday morning, arriving at 8 sharp to walk dogs and clean kennels and sit with the older cats who nobody wanted to adopt, giving them attention because she believed every creature deserved to feel loved. Her family was solid in all the ways that matter. Her father, David, worked as an engineer at the military base just outside Clarksville, the kind of steady, reliable man who never missed a school event and coached her younger brother's Little League team every spring. Her mother, Janet, taught 3rd grade at Bernstardin Elementary, had that particular patience that good elementary teachers possess, could diffuse a classroom crisis and make every child feel seen in the span of 5 minutes. Rosemary had 2 younger siblings, Marcus, who was 13, and Sarah, who was 10. And she was good with them in the way oldest children sometimes are, protective and slightly bossy, but genuinely invested in their lives. She helped Marcus with algebra homework and let Sarah practice braiding hair on her, even though it always came out crooked. The Hartleys lived in a modest 2-story on Willow Creek Drive, a street where kids still rode bikes and neighbors actually knew each other's names. They had a golden retriever named Biscuit, who Rosemary had begged for when she was 11, promising she'd do all the walking and feeding, a promise she'd actually kept. Friday nights were family movie nights with homemade popcorn and everyone piled on the sectional couch. Sundays meant church in the morning and big family dinners in the afternoon, usually with grandparents and aunts and uncles crammed around the dining room table. It was an ordinary life, beautifully ordinary, the kind that doesn't make headlines until tragedy forces it into the light. In the fall of 2018, Rosemary was thinking about colleges. She had a wall in her bedroom covered with brochures from universities across Tennessee and neighboring states, each one representing a possible future she was trying to imagine. Vanderbilt was the dream, ambitious and expensive, but her grades were strong enough that scholarships felt possible. University of Tennessee was the practical choice, in state tuition and a solid reputation. She'd been thinking about majoring in environmental science, maybe working for the National Park Service, combining her love of debate with her passion for conservation. She talked about wanting to make a difference, that vague teenage idealism that adults sometimes smile at, but that in Rosemary's case felt genuine because she was already making differences in small ways, one shelter dog and one thoughtful debate point at a time. She had a close group of friends, girls she'd known since elementary school, who still had sleepovers and inside jokes and made plans for senior year, like they were planning an expedition to Mars. There was Madison, her best friend since fourth grade, who she texted approximately 200 times a day about everything and nothing. There was Emma, who shared her love of true crime podcasts, and they'd spent hours theorizing about unsolved cases, never imagining that Rosemary would become a case, would become a story that other teenagers would one day listen to and try to solve. There was Olivia, who played flute in band and had been Rosemary's stand partner for 3 years, the kind of friendship built on shared sheet music and bad jokes during boring rehearsals. Boys were becoming interesting, but not yet all-consuming. There was a kid named Tyler in her AP English class who made her laugh and who she maybe had a tiny crush on, but it was the sweet, uncertain kind of 16-year-old attraction where holding hands felt monumental and the future was too big and far away to plan around anyone. Her parents liked Tyler well enough the few times he'd come around, thought he seemed polite and genuine, the kind of boy who still called adults sir and ma'am without being told. The last normal day of Rosemary Hartley's life was Thursday, October 18th, 2018. It was one of those perfect autumn days in Tennessee when the humidity finally breaks and the air turns crisp and the leaves are just starting to show their colors. Rosemary woke up at 6:30 like always, took a shower while playing music too loud, ate cereal standing at the kitchen counter while scrolling through her phone, the typical morning of a teenager who hadn't yet learned to sit still. She wore jeans and a Montgomery Central hoodie and her favorite worn-in Converse sneakers. She threw her clarinet case and backpack into her aging Honda Civic, the car she bought herself with money saved from 2 summers of lifeguarding at the community pool. School was unremarkable in the best way. She aced a quiz in calculus that she'd stressed about all week. She ate lunch with her friends in their usual spot under the oak tree by the science building, complaining about the amount of homework Mrs. Patterson assigned and making plans for homecoming the following week. She had band practice after school, spent 90 minutes in the hot band room running through the halftime show routine that still wasn't quite clean enough for the band director's exacting standards. Tyler caught up with her in the parking lot afterward, walked her to a car, said something that made her laugh, that easy unconscious laugh that people who knew her would say was the most Rosemary thing about her. She texted her mom at 5:15 saying she was stopping by the animal shelter for a quick visit, that she'd be home by 7 for dinner. Janet Hartley read the text while stirring pasta sauce, sent back a thumbs-up emoji and a reminder to drive safe. It was such a mundane exchange, the kind that happens 1,000 times in 1,000 households every day, meaningless, until suddenly it becomes the last message, the last normal moment before everything breaks. Rosemary's car was captured on a traffic camera heading toward the animal shelter at 5:23. She was alone in the vehicle, singing along to something, one hand on the wheel and the other tapping out a rhythm. She looked happy. She looked safe. She looked like a girl who had no idea that she had less than 2 hours left to live, that somewhere in the universe the clock was already counting down the final minutes of her ordinary, beautiful life. She never made it to the shelter. Somewhere between that traffic camera and her destination, Rosemary Hartley's story took a turn into darkness that no one who loved her could have predicted or prevented. By 7 o'clock, when she hadn't come home for dinner, her mother started calling. By 7:30, when the calls went straight to voicemail, worry turned to fear. By 8 o'clock, when Rosemary's car was found abandoned on a rural road 3 miles from the shelter with her phone still inside and her keys missing, the Hartley family's worst nightmare had begun. The first call to the Clarksville Police Department came in at 8:47 on the evening of October 18th, David Hartley's voice shaking as he reported his daughter missing. She was only 2 hours late. He knew that, knew the dispatcher was probably thinking he was overreacting. But he also knew his daughter, knew she never missed dinner without calling, knew something was catastrophically wrong in a way he couldn't articulate but could feel in his bones. The dispatcher took the information with professional calm, said an officer would be sent to take a report, But David could hear the subtext in her voice, the unspoken reality that 16-year-old girls are often just running late, that panic is usually premature. But David Hartley wasn't panicking without reason. His daughter's car had been found on Old Hickory Road with the driver's door open and her phone on the passenger seat still playing music, the battery at 42%, frozen in time like everything else. Officer Mike Daniels arrived at the Hartley home at 9:15 and immediately understood this wasn't a runaway situation or a teenager losing track of time. Janet Hartley sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from, her face pale and her eyes red from crying she was trying to control. Marcus and Sarah were upstairs with a neighbor who'd come over to stay with them, kept away from the growing crisis unfolding in their living room. David walked Officer Daniels through the timeline with the precision of someone fighting to maintain control, showing him the text messages, explaining about the animal shelter, about how Rosemary's car had been found by a passing motorist who'd stopped because the door was open and the interior lit. D was on and it looked wrong. Daniels drove out to Old Hickory Road and felt his stomach drop when he saw the Honda Civic sitting on the shoulder exactly as described. The car was still unlocked, keys nowhere to be found, Rosemary's backpack in the back seat and her clarinet case in the trunk. Her phone showed recent texts to Madison about homecoming dresses and a half-written Instagram caption that would never be posted. There were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. But the open door and the missing keys in the phone left behind told a story that every cop knows how to read, and it wasn't a story with a happy ending. By midnight, the Clarksville Police Department had mobilized a full search operation. Officers fanned out across the area surrounding Old Hickory Road, flashlights cutting through darkness, calling Rosemary's name into woods that swallowed sound and gave nothing back. Volunteers began arriving as word spread through the community. Neighbors and church members and parents who sent their own kids to Montgomery Central, people who needed to do something because the alternative was going home and imagining their own children in danger. They walked in lines through fields and forests, searched drainage ditches and abandoned buildings, anywhere a 16-year-old girl might be if she was hurt or hiding or worse. The search continued through the night and into Friday morning, growing larger as more volunteers arrived, and as the reality set in that Rosemary Hartley wasn't coming home on her own. Janet and David stayed at the command post set up in a church parking lot near the search area, drinking coffee they couldn't taste and staring at maps covered in grid marks showing areas already searched. Friends surrounded them with the awkward compassion of people who don't know what to say because there's nothing to say that makes this better. Madison arrived with her parents at dawn, her face swollen from crying, asking if she could help search, needing to do something because sitting at home was unbearable. The discovery came at 1:15 Friday afternoon, and it came in the worst possible way. A search team working through woods about half a mile from where Rosemary's car had been found radioed back to command with voices that had gone flat and professional in the way that means something terrible has been found. Detective James Morrison, who the 500th taken over coordination of the investigation that morning, drove out to the location with a dread that proved justified. Rosemary Hartley's body was found partially concealed under fallen leaves and branches in a shallow depression off a deer trail, like someone had tried to hide her but not tried very hard, or had run out of time, or simply hadn't cared enough to do more. She was still wearing her Montgomery Central hoodie and her Converse sneakers. Her face was turned toward the sky, eyes closed, looking almost peaceful, except for the visible injuries that told the story of violence, of a young life ended with brutal force. The medical examiner would later determine she'd died from blunt force trauma to the head, that death had likely been quick if not instantaneous, a small mercy in a situation devoid of mercy. The scene was immediately secured, yellow tape strung between trees to create a perimeter that would keep the curious and the grief-stricken away from evidence that might catch a killer. Morrison stood at the edge of the crime scene taking in details with the heavy knowledge that he'd have to walk back to that church parking lot and tell David and Janet Hartley that their daughter was dead, that the search was over, but in the worst possible way, that their lives as they knew them, ended in those woods. He'd delivered death notifications before, too many to count in 26 years of police work, but it never got easier. Never stopped feeling like he was dropping a bomb that would crater everything these families had built. He drove back to the command post with his partner, Detective Lisa Chen, and they walked David and Janet away from the volunteers to a quiet corner, where Morrison said the words that would replay in the Hartleys' minds forever. "We found Rosemary." I'm so sorry. She's gone. The sound Janet Hartley made wasn't quite a scream, more like all the air being forced from her lungs at once, a noise of pure anguish that made every person in that parking lot stop and know without being told that the worst had happened. David caught his wife as her legs gave out, held her up while his own face crumbled, and Morrison stood there feeling utterly useless because, what do you say? What can anyone say that matters when someone's child is dead and the world has revealed itself to be the kind of place where 16-year-old D girls get murdered on their way to volunteer at animal shelters? The crime scene was processed with the meticulous care that homicide investigations demand. Photographs were taken from every angle, documenting Rosemary's position and the surrounding area before anything was moved or disturbed. Evidence technicians searched in expanding circles, collecting anything that might be relevant: a cigarette butt, a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch, a partial shoe print in soft earth. The medical examiner arrived to officially pronounce death and oversee the removal of Rosemary's body, treating her with the dignity she deserved, even though dignity feels meaningless when applied to a dead teenager in the woods. The forensic evidence would prove crucial, though nobody knew it yet. DNA samples were collected from under Rosemary's fingernails, from her clothing, from her skin where her attacker had touched her. The samples were preserved and cataloged and sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation lab for analysis. They found genetic material that didn't belong to Rosemary, male DNA that told investigators their perpetrator had left part of himself behind at the scene. It was good evidence, solid evidence, the kind that could convict someone if they could just figure out who that someone was. The investigation moved forward with urgency. Morrison and Chen interviewed everyone in Rosemary's orbit, starting with family and working outward through friends and teachers and acquaintances. Tyler, the boy from AP English, was questioned extensively and quickly cleared, his alibi solid, with multiple witnesses placing him at baseball practice during the relevant time frame. Every student who'd interacted with Rosemary that day was interviewed. Every teacher who'd seen her. Every person who might have noticed something unusual or concerning. The animal shelter staff confirmed she'd never arrived for her visit. The last confirmed sighting was that traffic camera footage at 5:23 showing her alone in her car, singing, unaware. The DNA was run through CODIS, the national database that contains genetic profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees. It came back with no matches. Whoever had killed Rosemary Hartley either had no criminal record or had never been arrested in a jurisdiction that collected DNA. It was a dead end that felt like a gut punch. This piece of evidence that should have solved everything rendered useless by the simple fact that their killer wasn't in the system. Detectives pursued every possible lead with the intensity that cases involving murdered children demand. They looked at registered sex offenders in the area, interviewed and alibied every single one. They investigated whether Rosemary had any online connections that might have led someone to her, combing through her social media and email, and finding nothing but the normal digital life of a 16-year-old girl. They reviewed traffic camera footage from every camera within a 5-mile radius of Old Hickory Road, looking for vehicles that appeared at suspicious times, generating a list of dozens of cars that all led nowhere when followed up. They conducted a second search of the crime scene area in daylight, finding nothing new. They re-interviewed witnesses looking for inconsistencies or forgotten details, and found neither. By December, 2 months after Rosemary's murder, the investigation had slowed from a sprint to a frustrated walk. Every obvious lead had been exhausted. Every person who might have had opportunity or motive had been cleared. The DNA evidence sat in a file like a promise unkept, containing the identity of Rosemary's killer but unable to reveal it. Morrison kept working the case, but he was also carrying a full load of newer investigations, cases where the trail was fresh and witnesses' memories were sharp. The Hartley case wasn't closed, would never be officially closed, but the daily work stopped because there was simply nowhere else to go with the tools available in 2018. The community slowly returned to normal the way communities always do after tragedy. But Clarksville had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Parents held their children tighter, said "I love you" more often, felt a background hum of anxiety that hadn't existed before. Montgomery Central held a memorial service in the gymnasium that filled beyond capacity, students and teachers and community members gathering to remember a girl who should have been planning for prom instead of being eulogized. They planted a tree in her honor outside the band room, a young oak that would grow strong while Rosemary stayed forever 16. The animal shelter named their Volunteer of the Year award after her, a small immortality that felt both touching and inadequate. For the Hartley family, time fractured into before and after, and they existed in the after, like ghosts haunting their own lives. Janet took a leave of absence from teaching that became permanent, unable to face a classroom of 8-year-olds when her own daughter was gone. David returned to work after 2 weeks because staying home meant drowning in grief. But co-workers said he was different, quieter, older somehow. Marcus and Sarah tried to navigate adolescence with the weight of murdered sister syndrome, that particular burden of being the surviving siblings, feeling guilty for living while Rosemary didn't, for laughing or feeling joy or moving forward when she was frozen forever in October of 28. Every year on October 18th, they visited Rosemary's grave at Greenwood Cemetery, where she was buried under a headstone that read, "Beloved daughter and sister, forever in our hearts." The first anniversary drew dozens of people, friends and neighbors bringing flowers and sharing memories. By the third anniversary, the crowd had thinned to mostly family. By the fifth, it was just the Hartleys standing in silence, asking questions that had no answers, wondering if justice would ever come, or if Rosemary's killer would remain forever free, forever unknown, forever winning. Detective Morrison retired in 2022 with the Hartley case still unsolved, one of 3 homicides he'd never cleared in a career spanning nearly 3 decades. He'd kept her file on his desk until his last day, kept her school picture pinned to his bulletin board, a constant reminder of failure, even though he knew intellectually he'd done everything possible with the technology available. When Detective Sarah Chen inherited his cold cases, she looked at that picture of Rosemary Hartley smiling in her sophomore year school photo and made a quiet promise. Technology was changing. DNA databases were evolving. Genetic genealogy was solving cases that had been cold for decades. If there was any chance to give this family answers, Chen was going to find it. The breakthrough in Rosemary Hartley's case began not in Clarksville but in California, with a different case entirely, a different monster who'd hidden in plain sight for decades. In April of 2018, 6 months before Rosemary's murder, investigators arrested a 72-year-old former police officer named Joseph D'Angelo for a series of rapes and murders committed in the 70s and 80s. D'Angelo was the Golden State Killer, one of the most prolific uncaught serial offenders in American history, and he'd been identified through a revolutionary technique called genetic genealogy. Investigators had uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database, found distant relatives, built family trees going back generations, then worked forward to identify D'Angelo as the only person who fit the profile. It was forensic detective work combined with genealogical research, and it changed everything about how cold cases could be solved. Detective Sarah Chen had followed the Golden State Killer case obsessively, recognizing immediately that this technique could revolutionize cold case investigation. She attended training seminars on genetic genealogy, read case studies about successful identifications, networked with investigators who'd used the method to crack cases that seemed impossibly cold. By 2023, genetic genealogy had solved hundreds of cases across the country, giving families answers they'd waited decades to receive. Chen looked at the stack of cold case files on her desk, cases she'd inherited from Morrison and others, and her eyes kept returning to Rosemary Hartley's folder. The DNA evidence was solid, preserved properly, waiting for technology to catch up with truth. In January of 2024, Chen decided it was time to try something new. The first challenge was the DNA sample itself. Genetic genealogy works best with robust, complete profiles, and the samples from Rosemary's case, while good enough for traditional database searches, had been stored for over 5 years. Chen consulted with forensic geneticists about whether the evidence was viable for genealogical analysis. The answer was cautiously optimistic. With modern extraction and amplification techniques, they might be able to enhance the profile enough to make it useful for genealogy databases. It would require sending the evidence to a specialized lab, and it wouldn't be cheap. The Clarksville Police Department would need to allocate significant budget to a case that was already 6 years cold with no guarantee of success. Chen made her pitch to the department brass in February, armed with statistics about genetic genealogy success rates and a passionate argument about the department's obligation to Rosemary Hartley and her family. She pointed out that the case had shaken the community's sense of safety, that parents still felt afraid letting their teenagers drive alone because a killer had never been caught. She emphasized that solving this case would demonstrate the department's commitment to justice, regardless of how much time had passed. The pitch worked. In late February of 2024, Chen got approval to proceed with genetic genealogy analysis. The evidence was sent to Othram Labs in Texas, a company specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing that had successfully worked numerous cold cases. The process was technical and slow, extracting degraded DNA from the preserved samples, amplifying the genetic material using proprietary techniques, then sequencing the genome to create a profile that could be uploaded to genealogy databases. Chen checked in weekly for updates, fighting impatience, reminding herself that good forensic work couldn't be rushed. Finally, in late March of 2024, she got the call she'd been hoping for. Othram had successfully created an enhanced DNA profile suitable for genealogical analysis. They were ready to begin the search. The profile was uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, databases that permit law enforcement access under specific protocols. Within 48 hours, the system identified several matches, distant relatives who shared segments of DNA with the unknown perpetrator. These weren't close matches, not parents or siblings or even first cousins, but third and fourth cousins, people separated by several generations who shared common ancestors born in the 1800s. To most people, these would be strangers, relatives so distant you'd never meet them at family reunions. But to a genetic genealogist, they were breadcrumbs leading back to a family tree that could be built and analyzed and ultimately used to identify a killer. Chen hired a forensic genealogist named Robert Hayes, a retired history teacher who'd discovered a talent for building family trees while researching his own ancestry and had transitioned into consulting work after the Golden State Killer breakthrough. Hayes was methodical and patient, the kind of researcher who could spend 16 hours staring at census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses and find connections that others would miss. He began the painstaking work of identifying the common ancestors shared by the DNA matches, then building out complete family trees showing all descendants. This meant diving into historical records going back to the Civil War era, tracing families through migrations and name changes and deaths, assembling a massive genealogical puzzle where each piece was a human life. The work took weeks. Hayes would send Chen periodic updates, dense reports with hand-drawn family trees showing multiple generations and highlighting individuals who warranted further investigation. By early May, he'd identified 2 family lines that both connected back to Middle Tennessee in the 1860s. The challenge was narrowing down which descendants from these lines would have been the right age and in the right location to have murdered Rosemary Hartley. The initial list included over 60 male descendants who would have been between 18 and 60 in October of 2018. Many could be eliminated immediately because they died before 2018 or were living in other states with documentation proving they couldn't have been in Clarksville. But that still left dozens of viable candidates who needed investigation. Chen and her team began the delicate process of background checks without alerting their subjects. They pulled DMV records, employment histories, property records, anything public that would tell them where these men had been living in 2018, and whether they had any connection to Clarksville or to Rosemary. Most could be eliminated fairly quickly, men who'd moved away years earlier or who had solid alibis for other reasons. But as they worked through the list through May and into June, one name kept drawing Chen's attention. A man who not only lived in Clarksville in 2018 but had lived there his entire life. A man whose address in October of 2018 placed him less than 3 miles from Old Hickory Road. A man who had worked as a substitute teacher at Montgomery Central High School, though not during the fall semester when Rosemary was killed. A man who, on paper, looked like a completely normal, upstanding citizen, but who fit the geographic and temporal parameters perfectly. His name was Derek Mitchell, 43 years old in 2024, married with 2 teenage children of his own. He worked as an insurance adjuster, had for 15 years, steady employment with no disciplinary issues. He coached youth basketball through the YMCA, attended New Hope Community Church with his family, served on the HOA board for his subdivision. His social media showed a man devoted to his kids, posting pictures of their sports games and school achievements, sharing dad jokes and motivational quotes. He looked like every suburban father you'd see at Target on a Saturday afternoon, unremarkable in every way except for the genetic markers that connected him through generations of ancestors to DNA found on Rosemary Hartley's body. Chen felt her pulse quicken as she dug deeper into Mitchell's background. His employment records showed he'd worked as a substitute teacher at Montgomery Central from 2015 through the spring of 2018, filling in for various teachers on sick leave or personal days. He would have known the school's layout, would have been familiar with students, even if he'd never taught Rosemary specifically. He would have understood teenage schedules and routines. In October of 2018, he'd been between substitute teaching and his current insurance job, a gap of unemployment that meant he had no workplace alibi for the evening. Rosemary disappeared. It was all circumstantial, all suggestive, but not proof. Chen needed direct DNA evidence, a sample from Mitchell that could be compared to the crime scene profile, and she needed to obtain it legally in a way that would hold up in court. The standard approach was collecting abandoned DNA, items discarded in public that were legally considered trash and therefore accessible without a warrant. But that required surveillance, patience, and luck. Chen initiated surveillance on Derek Mitchell in mid-June, assigning a rotating team to follow him and wait for an opportunity. They watched him drop his kids at summer camp and drive to work. They watched him run errands and attend church and coach basketball practices. They watched him live a completely normal life with no apparent awareness that genetic genealogy had connected him to a 6-year-old murder. They watched and waited for him to throw away a coffee cup or a water bottle or a straw, anything with saliva that could yield DNA. The opportunity came on July 9th. Mitchell stopped at a Starbucks during his lunch break, ordered a venti iced coffee, and sat at an outdoor table scrolling through his phone while he drank. When he finished, he tossed the empty cup in a trash can near the entrance and drove away. The surveillance team waited 15 minutes to be safe, then retrieved the cup, carefully bagging it as evidence and maintaining chain of custody. The cup was rushed to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation lab with urgent priority. Chen felt hope and dread in equal measure, that familiar tension of knowing everything hinged on this moment. Either the DNA would match and they'd have their killer, or it wouldn't and they'd be back at the beginning, and she didn't know if she could bear calling the Hartley family to say they'd been so close but come up empty. The lab results came back on July 22nd, a Tuesday afternoon when Chen was reviewing other case files and trying not to obsess about the pending results. The forensic scientist's voice on the phone was carefully neutral when she called, but Chen could hear the excitement underneath the professionalism. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from Rosemary Hartley's crime scene. Not a familial match suggesting a relative, but a direct match. The probability of it being anyone other than Derek Mitchell was roughly 1 in several trillion. They had their killer. After 6 years, after thousands of investigative hours, after technological advances and genealogical research and patient surveillance, they finally knew who had murdered Rosemary Hartley. Chen sat at her desk, staring at the lab report, feeling 6 years of frustration compress into this single moment of certainty. She called the district attorney's office and arranged a meeting for the following morning. She pulled every piece of evidence and organized it into a prosecutable package. She prepared an arrest warrant application that laid out the entire case from the original investigation, through the genetic genealogy breakthrough to the surveillance and the damning DNA match. On July 25th, Judge Martin Rodriguez signed the warrant without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming. Chen spent the evening before the arrest unable to sleep, mentally rehearsing every step of the plan. They'd execute the warrant at Mitchell's home at dawn, minimizing the chance of resistance or flight. 6 officers plus herself, all briefed on the subject's background and potential risks. Mitchell had no history of violence beyond this single horrific crime, no weapons registered in his name, nothing suggesting he'd resist. But he was a murderer, and they'd be taking no chances. The unmarked sedan came to a stop just as the first light of dawn broke over Mitchell's subdivision, and Chen stepped out into air that smelled like cut grass and morning dew, ordinary smells for an extraordinary moment. She walked to the front door with her team behind her and knocked 3 firm times that echoed in the pre-dawn quiet. Lights flickered on inside. A dog barked. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal Derek Mitchell in basketball shorts and a worn t-shirt, his hair messy from sleep, confusion crossing his face as he registered the badges and the number of officers on his porch. Chen identified herself and informed Mitchell he was under arrest for the murder of Rosemary Hartley. For just a moment there was nothing on his face, just blank incomprehension, as if his brain couldn't process what she'd said. Then something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition or resignation. There and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Mitchell didn't resist as Chen placed him in handcuffs. He was silent, completely silent, as they led him to a patrol car while his wife stood in the doorway asking what was happening. What had Derek done? There must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. DNA doesn't lie, and time doesn't erase what you've done. Chen called Janet Hartley from the station 2 hours later, reaching her at home mid-morning. Janet answered on the first ring with that particular tension in her voice that never quite goes away when you're the mother of a murdered child and a detective is calling. Chen spoke carefully, clearly telling her they'd made an arrest in Rosemary's case, that the suspect was in custody, that DNA evidence had definitively linked him to the crime. Janet was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was shaking. She asked who, and Chen told her Derek Mitchell's name, explained his background and his connection to Montgomery Central. Janet said the name meant nothing to her. They'd never heard Rosemary mention anyone named Mitchell. Couldn't understand why this stranger had stolen their daughter. Chen had no answer that would satisfy, because sometimes there is no answer that makes sense of senseless violence. The arrest made national news by evening. Another cold case solved for genetic genealogy. Another family finally getting answers. Mitchell was arraigned and charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty on advice of his attorney, but the DNA evidence was insurmountable. In September, facing overwhelming evidence and the likelihood of conviction at trial, Mitchell accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for 25 years to life, meaning he'd be eligible for parole in his late 60s, but would likely die in prison. He offered no explanation, no motive, no apology that would matter. Some questions would remain forever unanswered. On October 18, 2024, the 6th anniversary of the last day anyone saw Rosemary alive, but the first anniversary after justice had been served, the Hartley family returned to Greenwood Cemetery. They stood beside Rosemary's grave under a clear autumn sky that looked exactly like the sky from that last perfect Thursday, and this time when they stood there in silence, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. It was the silence of peace, hard-won and imperfect, but real. They'd never stop missing their daughter and sister, never stop wishing for the years that had been stolen, never fully understand why Derek Mitchell had done what he'd done. But they had answers now, and they had justice, and Detective Chen had kept her promise. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment and let us know if you remember when this case broke in your community. If you followed the investigation, if you believe that genetic genealogy is giving families the closure they deserve. Because cases like Rosemary's prove that DNA never forgets, that technology and dedicated investigators can bring light to even the coldest cases, and that time may pass, but truth has a way of surfacing when the right tools finally exist to reveal it.